Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to those joining from far and wide in the west and the east. It so happens that the year of 2014 is the year of the small island states declared by the United Nations. And the webinar today that I am going to basically give will have a focus on vulnerability and adaptation to climate change in island states across the world. The presentation is a compilation of work being done by my colleagues from the Institute, Mr. Suruchi Bhadwal, Ms. Himani Upadhyay, and myself. And I will just be sharing with you, a few concerns about research in these areas. And towards the end, basically take your question answers if there are any. To begin with, basically, small island states are generally located in the tropics, the subtropics, in the Pacific and Indian Ocean, and the Caribbean region. These regions basically face major pressures due to surrounding oceans and seas, and there's a major influence on their biophysical and socioeconomic structures and activities of the small island developing states. There are lots of ecosystem services that further limit the capacity of these small island developing states to adapt to future climate change and sea level rise that further affects the lives and livelihoods of many living in these countries or island nations. The IPCC Working Group 2 AR5 that was recently released basically mentions that the high vulnerability and low adaptive capacity to climate change of these island nations renders the countries living in these countries with legitimate concerns about the risks related to exposure to them. The impacts on small islands are well known to many. They are uniquely exposed to threats related to sea level rise, tropical and extratropical cyclones, storm surges, increasing air and sea surface temperatures, coastal erosion, and groundwater contamination, and many other impacts that are interrelated. The concerns are due to limited area that these island nations have, and the scope for them to spread themselves out if there is a risk in the coastal stretches. The huge impacts, therefore, on both natural and human systems, which contribute in turn to the vulnerabilities of the region. Now, we go one by one related to the risks, the impacts that these regions face. Sea level rise basically is a contribution due to both melting of glaciers and polar ice sheets because of increased warming that the world is experiencing, including thermal expansion of oceans because of increasing temperatures. Basically, there is this phenomenon where the water expands, and therefore the sea levels in turn basically rise. There are already observational evidences that prove that the sea levels are increasing, and there's enough proof in the 20th century across the world in different parts where it has been recorded that in many parts sea levels have increased over the years. Climate-sensitive processes and components basically influence the global and regional sea levels, and the increase in the sea levels is not just isolated in terms of what's happening in the seas, but it's also interrelated to many other factors that link to the terrestrial surfaces, that link to the hydrological cycle, that link to the cryospheric changes that are happening. So to begin with, the hydrological cycle and the rainfall that we receive and the runoff that then from land moves into the waters in the seas and the oceans have a certain contribution to the sea levels that we see around us. Apart from that, with increased warming, as I said, the melting of the glaciers and increased runoff also contributes to increase in the sea level. There's also a contribution that we see, large-scale contribution in the melting of ice sheets both in the Arctic and the Antarctic, which have a greater component in terms of resulting in increasing sea levels. Besides, as I said, there is thermal expansion of the oceans and the seas further contributing to the increase in the sea level. And any change in any one of the components or processes of like I said, the hydrological cycle, the cryospheric system and the terrestrial system would in turn have a total impact on the increase in sea levels. And while there is global sea level that is observed, regionally there would be variations and distinctions across different parts of the world in terms of the extent to which we would be observing increase in sea levels. To begin with, there are shifting surface winds. The rate of expansion of warming of the ocean water next to the land is another factor. The addition of melting ice that contributes to runoff in the adjoining seas and oceans. Past and present variations in the distribution of land ice, localized geological features, basically places or regions that already are lowland may basically have a higher exposure to the increasing sea levels because they're already below a certain limit, and any increase in the sea level may contribute to a greater impact. Localized processes such as sediment compaction and plate tectonic activity also have an influence on the extent to which sea level rise will be observed regionally. And therefore, a combination of all these factors may therefore at a regional level determine whether the sea level rise is going to be at the higher end or at the lower end, and the extent to which the rise is likely in future time periods. There are multiple complementary indicators of a changing global climate apart from the rising sea levels, and in the recent AR5, the Working Group 1 report on the science, basically there's enough proof to see that there are various factors or parameters that are already changing. And to begin with, we have interesting graphs that take us back in time from 1850 onwards till 2000 or off late to show how the different parameters have been changing. Land surface temperature has been increasing over time. Sea surface temperatures have been increasing. From 1850 onwards, if you date back and look at the data and the literature, you see that even marine air temperatures have been increasing and sea surface temperatures have been increasing. Sea level rise also has been increasing. Sea ice has been declining. So with the sea ice declining, the sea level is rising. So you start correlating these different variables, and you see that there is a strong correlation of decline in sea ice content, in glacial content, increase in precipitation and runoff corresponding to increase in sea level rise. So there are interlinkages across the different parameters and the directions of changes in these various parameters, and the contribution in turn to the increase in sea levels and the threat then to coastal regions and island states. We're also having observational evidence of increases in temperatures. The IPCC basically says that the warming is unequivocal, and there is proof enough during the 20th century that from 1901 to 2012, there has been an increase in the surface temperatures to the tune of in some parts from 0.4 degrees Celsius to 0.8 degrees Celsius in different parts. And in some cases, it's been a little higher than that. There are also observational evidences related to changes in precipitation in different parts of the world. Some places are likely to observe an increase, while others are likely to observe, a decrease. And there are different types of assessments done in different parts of the world to basically arrive at different conclusions. There is observational evidence, so there's data collected from different parts of the world, and there is reanalysis data, which basically provides us with the results of changing precipitation patterns across the world. There is observational evidence of decline in sea ice. Annual mean Arctic summer sea ice in the 20th century over the period of 1979 to 2012 has declined at the rate of 3.5 to 4.1% per decade, and the science basically indicates that there's a very high degree of confidence in basically indicating the decline in sea ice. And the decline is basically observed to be much higher during the summer periods compared to the other periods. There's also observational evidence of decline in decline in the ice content in the Greenland ice sheet and the Antarctic region, and there are satellite imageries which basically show the rate of ice loss across these different regions, and there's considerable amount of ice loss that is being observed. There is an indication that there's a high degree of loss that is observed both in the Greenland region and the Antarctic region. There's also proof, that now you get to see in the media, and basically this is a quote from a press release a week back in India, indicating the faster rate of decline of ice in the Antarctic region, basically becoming a concern for many scientists across the world. The science also indicates, how the glaciers are behaving in different parts of the world, and this is basically a slide which shows, different parts of the world and how the glaciers are behaving in those different parts, starting from Alaska, going down to the Andes, and in Southern Asia, Northern Asia, and Central Europe. Basically, if you see the trends of the different glaciers, the net impact is a decline, and in some cases, steep declines are being observed in the ice content. This is again a slide picked up from a press release this week, I think, about the glaciers that are retreating in the South Asian region, and a study done by a university in India indicating concerns about a certain catchment which is perennial in nature and is snow-fed, about the changes in runoff and the changes in the glacial mass balance, which may then have implications on societies and the dependence on river water runoff. The observational evidences of rises in global mean sea levels, and it has been basically concluded that the rate of increases have been increasing in the 20th century. These are examples of regional estimates for sea surface height, and you see the distinctions across different regions of the world, and in every case there has been an increase in the sea surface height. In India, basically, mean sea level rise, looking at the trends of these increases along the Indian coast for different coastal ports, one observes that in the 20th century, overall there has been an increase across all the regions, with Kolkata having the highest increases of 5.74 millimeters per year, compared to Visakhapatnam, which basically has observed a 1.09 millimeter per year increase. So there is data that is collected from the tide gauge stations and from the Survey of India to be able to arrive at such computations to see what has been the rate of increase in the 20th century. There's also a clear attribution to link it to the climate change processes, where models basically say that when you combine the natural changes with the anthropogenic forcing, that is when you basically are able to get the right trajectories of changes which we are observing right now, and therefore it's a strong attribution, basically indicating that the anthropogenic changes which in turn cause climate change, somewhere are responsible for these changes that we observe. In terms of changes, so while we have been seeing changes in the past, we are also simulating changes for the future, given that we are concerned of the direction in which these changes are happening. And global mean sea level changes for future time periods have been indicated in the latest IPCC report, and the rate of increase has been reported across different scenarios. And one observes basically that the increases are as significant as 0.2 0.24 to 0.30 meters from a low-end scenario to a high-end scenario. Temperature projections also for different scenarios basically indicate an increase in the temperatures, and therefore all models basically indicate an increase, and none of the models, so they are in agreement at least that there is going to be an increase, and none of the models show a decline. And similar is the case in terms of sea level rise. The projections for 2100 are basically in the range of 52 to 98 centimeters, and each model, the number of models that are run basically indicate an increase in the sea levels. There is also projection that rainfall is likely to vary in future time periods, and under different scenarios, basically different patterns of change that are likely to be observed. In a low-end scenario, the rate of change may be comparatively less, and compared to a high-end scenario. Also, there would be large-scale regional variations in terms of the patterns of change and the rainfall distribution. While there are some regions that are likely to experience an increase in rainfall, but the distribution patterns may vary and still be skewed, and there may be pockets of dry areas within the areas which are likely to receive high rainfall. So there is a need for further research to be able to arrive at conclusions and recommendations based on these changes. There's also a projected decline in sea ice extent both in the glaciers and in the ice sheets in the Arctic, Antarctic, and the Greenland ice sheet. Basically, it has been concluded that there would be large-scale contributions to the sea levels from the melting of these ice sheets in future time periods under various scenarios. And under the most extreme scenario, which is the RCP 8.5, we would be facing a most extreme scenario where most of the ice in the polar caps would have been melted. In addition to the sea level rise, coastal regions and small islands are also exposed to cyclones, storm surges. In some places, people call it as typhoons, hurricanes in coastal regions, etc. And one has observed over the period of 1970 and projecting it into the future, one sees that these incidents of the cyclones are likely to increase in number, and across the world, if you were to see the spread of which regions are getting affected, of course, a large percentage of the risk lies in the Asian region, in the Asia and Pacific region. There are countries with huge coastal lines or coastal stretches which are exposed. But there are also countries with, many island nations that are there in this part of the world, which may be facing the consequences of increase of these cyclones, hurricanes, typhoons that we are likely to observe. There is an increased risk to island nations in the Indian Ocean, Pacific Ocean, the Caribbean, and other islands, and basically. In a nutshell, the risk to the exposure to cyclones is going to be considerably high. So there have been assessments in terms of studying if the number of these cyclones or these events are likely to increase in the future. But most studies indicate that while there may not be a higher change or change in the frequency or the occurrence of these events, but the intensities are likely to change. So the severity of these events may increase, although the frequency may remain the same. So I would just take a break here now, and we are opening the call for your inputs, and we're going to share a question with you for you to share your responses and your understanding about the topic. These changes and in terms of sea level rise and increased cyclonic activity, storm surges, etc., would be felt on the coastal stretches and the island nations, and there are different kinds of impacts that we would be observing. starting from impacts on the island morphology, impacts on ecosystem and natural resources, impacts on island livelihoods, impacts on settlements and infrastructure. What I have in this slide is the different nature of impacts under each of these categories, and this relates to coastal island erosion, coastal island accretion, flooding and marine inundation, delta river estuary floodplain changes, coastal landslides, cliff and hill slope changes, coastal reef damage, damage to mangroves, coastal wetlands, soil salinization and inundation, saline intrusion into fresh-water, damage to destruction of subsistence crops, losses in commercial agriculture, decrease in fish production, damage to and losses in aquaculture, losses in tourism sector, destruction of buildings and houses, damage to transportation facilities, damage to public facilities related to water supply and energy, and damage to health and safety infrastructure, and towards the end also damage to cultural assets. So while there are these impacts that will be felt across different categories, all these categories are interlinked, and one impact across one of the aspects may have an impact on the other. So I was just giving you an indication of the different categories of impacts that are likely. But in the AR5, it has been reported that they have looked into the priority concerns of small island states, and from the small islands, basically there has been a conclusion that these are the priority areas of concern to them. And if we were to look at what they have highlighted, the island nations have highlighted as priority areas, basically we conclude that they indicate that sea level rise definitely is a concern to these island nations. Changes in beaches and coastal stretches are another area of concern, and this is largely to do with, I guess, inundation of land as well as coastal erosion that one is likely to experience, impacts on biodiversity, both flora and fauna in these regions. Tourism is an important sector and revenue source for the small island states, and the flora and fauna are one of the attraction points for many people, apart from the fact that many local people also depend on the flora and fauna to sustain their livelihoods in these states. Therefore, impacts on biodiversity becomes a serious concern, including impacts on marine ecosystems and coral bleaching, water resources and agriculture, if it's being practiced because of saltwater intrusion in underground aquifers, and therefore limited availability of freshwater resources. There is implication on human health, settlements and infrastructure. There are interlinkages then of all these impacts on these various sectors on the tourism that one could see across these different island nations. And there is, in the end, loss of socio-cultural and traditional assets as a result of all these risks that one is likely to experience or face in these regions. These regions are unique. They have inherent physical and social characteristics which subject them to high level of vulnerability to multiple stressors, both climate and non-climate. They have distinctive geomorphology, dynamic culture, unique ecosystems, dense population, and isolated geography that makes them unique and exposed to the risks that we are talking about. However, the risks to them are not uniform, basically because of their different locational aspects, and therefore, because of that, the risk profiles for the small islands varies across different parts of the world. There is a high diversity in the physical and human attributes of the different small islands, and as a result of which the impacts, vulnerability, and adaptation would be variable from one island region to another. The island vulnerability, in a nutshell, is a function of 4 key stressors: socioeconomic, physical, socio-ecological, and climate-induced. Under socioeconomic, basically, there are issues related to managing urbanization, high population density in these centers, pollution and sanitation. Under biophysical, basically it's related to the geophysical characteristics of the islands and the inherent physical vulnerabilities of these islands. Under socio-ecological, largely linked to habitat loss and degradation, loss to flora and fauna, and overexploitation of resources. And under climate-induced, it's basically linked to reinforcing mechanisms and determining the magnitude of impacts. This popular perception versus islanders' perception, and this is basically through some studies that have been done in island nations. There is a perception that is generated about what is important, what is a priority for these island nations, and what is not. Popular perceptions about islands, islanders, and about climate change linked to island nations basically is that the islands are sinking. The islanders will have to seek refuge in other countries as climate refugees. But it is very important to drive home the fact that to get to know what do islanders think about the risks at their end. Do these islanders think that migration is a solution from the islands to relocate themselves to other places which are more safe? And can migration actually be a solution or an adaptation strategy for them? And what are the other possibilities of adaptation or prioritizing in situ adaptation in these island nations? So looking at the various facts and the perceptions across the board about climate change, migration, adaptation linked to the island nations, basically there are different viewpoints that we get across the board. Migration, in certain cases has been considered to be an important adaptation strategy, but simultaneously, it has also been indicated in many parts as a failure for adaptation. There is a strong feeling about in the local population that they are not ready to accept a refugee status and would not like to relocate from a place where they had been basically living for generations to come. There's also this direct causal link between environmental change and migration that is being assumed, and maybe there are other causal factors also that are responsible for the changes, and which may basically be the reason for which people are migrating. So there's a need to identify the clear causal loops in terms of what is the cause for migration of certain people from island nations, and it may not necessarily be because of the risks of climate change or the extremes of climate. As an important adaptation strategy, basically it has been observed in many cases that people who have moved from island nations to other nations have been successful in sending back remittances to families who have stayed back, and it has helped in the development of the people back in their home countries, and therefore it presents a positive story of migration. Income diversification has happened, and therefore it has benefited communities. It has also resulted in some cases in improving the access to improved technology and information, and thereby also strengthening the adaptive capacity of these regions. There's a shifting focus from adaptation when actually there's this perception there's a shifting focus from adaptation when one is talking about migration as a strategy for adaptation in island nations. There are certain papers which very strongly talk about different views about migration and adaptation. Adger and Barnett in 2005 basically said that promoting migration as an adaptation strategy detracts the focus from adaptation and basically takes it to a different focus where basically we are asking people to move from their locations to other places, and whether those other places are open to accepting a new society and their culture in their grounds is also questionable. In 2011, Adger et al. Again basically highlighted that migration may ostensibly be adaptation, but cannot be considered successful if it results in damage to people's traditions, knowledge, social orders, identities, and material cultures. And in 2005, Barnett basically concludes that if adaptation constrains people's legitimate right to development, that it cannot be considered as successful. And given all these, all this research and concerns of the local people in island nations, what is required is that it is important to consider the local perceptions, priorities, and needs for adaptation of people living in these island nations, and create a fourth dimension of understanding of what would be best given the risks that we are talking about for island nations to do or intervene in certain directions which may help reduce the risks that they are exposed to. There are circumstances where people are not willing to leave their localities even under dangerous, risky circumstances. There is also this perception of islanders or people living in island nations that it basically erodes people's values, culture, and place belongingness. And therefore, and the risk that, once they have migrated, there's very little possibility of return to their homeland. And can then migration be termed as adaptation for these nations? There are different examples from different island nations and voices from those nations that have been kind of documented in the peer review journals and journal processes. We have different examples of voices that have been raised from Tuvalu, from the Tuvalu Islands, Kiribati Islands, and the Maldives. The Tuvalu Islands basically were the first to be categorized as a nation which is at risk and basically requires certain interventions internationally to be looked into to be able to protect to be able to protect the people living in that island nation. But the islanders themselves disagree with the media constructed status. They do not consider that the islands are disappearing and that the communities are in crisis, and similar experiences and voices have been heard from the other nations as well. But while on one side, this is the phase that we get to see in terms of resistance towards migration and being relocated, and similar concerns being also felt at the end of the island nations. On the other side, there is a different notion that basically is being observed. We do have countries, the same countries, who have said that they basically don't feel that there is a risk. Having bilateral consultations with countries to buy land in other countries to be able to relocate the people. For example, the country of Maldives has bought land in Australia, and it is in discussion with other countries like India and Sri Lanka to explore options to relocate its population. Basically, therefore, looking at both sides of the discussion where, at one end you do have the risk and you do have a certain strategy that seems to be promising and has been discussed at length in many research papers, about migration. What we find is that many island communities are not in agreement with such a strategy to be quoted as an adaptation strategy. There is a strong denial to basically promote migration as an adaptation strategy in these nations. People don't want to move from the countries, and they do realize that such kind of a movement may result in them losing their culture, their homeland forever. And therefore, it has a greater impact on them than what is foreseen. So I think now I'd continue with the slides, and I said that people are not interested in moving, and therefore the other option that they look towards is in situ adaptation, which can enable them to live in their homeland and look for options within their countries. The IPCC, the recent report released of the IPCC basically concludes that adaptation to climate change generates larger benefit to small islands when delivered in conjunction with other development activities such as disaster risk reduction and community-based approaches to development. There are important things like raising awareness and communicating future risks to local communities that actually would most likely help reduce the losses to life and property and protect the natural resources from extremes in these regions, because it may result in better preparedness and response to these events. So there are some things that we can do at our end where you actually can contribute to reducing the losses that these regions face, and it is largely to do with raising awareness and making people aware of the risks that they're likely to face, so that then they are able to organize themselves in a manner which may then cause lesser degree of harm or losses. There's this interesting figure in the WG2AR5 in the chapter on small islands, which basically talks about the climate and socioeconomic stresses, in turn, investment in effective adaptation and vulnerability reduction. And as you see, as we move up towards the right-hand corner, the island nations basically lying in that category would face high degrees of vulnerability and require greater investment in effective adaptation. So as the climate stress is increasing and the socioeconomic stresses are also becoming worse, then the requirement for investment in adaptation would be quite high, and vulnerability reduction would be a necessity. So there are options of community-based in situ adaptation that one could look at, with a focus on community-based adaptation principles to facilitate adaptation planning and implementation, example through marine catch monitoring while addressing local priorities, and building on local knowledge and capacity, increasing the collaboration between community organizations, and strengthening the local networks and information flow across these island nations, building adaptive capacity with traditional knowledge, technologies, and skills on small islands, building elevated settlements and resilient structures and working collectively, and storing community food supplies for times of need. So there are different options that can be explored and interventions which can then be taken forward along with the community and their priorities for implementation. What if people are unwilling to move? Then where should policy and research focus? Is in situ adaptation a solution to better the lives of communities living in these nations and reduce the risk that is posed to them, to better prepare communities and increase their resilience, and focus on priorities of people and their choices, and then basically identify interventions? Context-specific assessments at the ground level would be a prerequisite before making any estimates about people and their priorities in these countries. There would be a need for what kind of institutional governance and legal options should be in place to discuss the mobility patterns of these communities, and these definitely have to link with ethical, political, legal, cultural, and human rights concerns. The challenges of resource sharing. So I go back to my presentation, challenges of resource sharing and socio-cultural impacts on both the migrating and receiving communities. So it's just not about people who are migrating from the island nations, but also when they're moving to a new location, there are challenges of distribution of resources that exist, and to what extent would it be an ethical distribution or which takes into account equity. Need for, so while all these challenges do exist, there is need for support for these countries that is felt, both for technological support and financial support. And also there is a need that internationally, globally, there is a focus on the small island nations to see how effectively these nations can respond to the threats of climate change. So with this, we now conclude the webinar, and thank you for your participation. We do have many questions from the participants. And the idea is to basically respond to y'all through email. We will be in touch with you, I think, and get back to you for responses. Also, you will be receiving a recorded version of the webinar. I think it will be emailed to you. There were a list of questions that were posted to us prior to the webinar, and the nature of the questions were largely related to the tools and techniques that are used for the assessments. Many questions actually were related to awareness, outreach activities, and needs in the small island states, and I would say that's very important because much of the risk would be reduced if people are aware about what risks they are exposed to. And so that, individually at their level, they would be able to take the right kinds of measures to be able to respond to those risks. Some of the questions related to the science and the impacts that are likely to be faced by these island nations, that was covered in the presentation. And many questions were also focusing on what action is needed, both on the technological front and also in terms of financial support. And all these questions, I would say, in a way, are very critical, crucial, to be taken forward and in consideration in the lines of small island states and reduction of risks related to climate change. In detail, basically, I would respond to the queries that have been posed through email and get back to you. Thank you.